505 confirmed kills in 100 days. If you break down the mathematics of the Winter War, that is an average of 5 men eliminated every 24 hours, operating continuously in an environment that systematically destroys human tissue. We're looking at a statistical impossibility. On one side of the Kola front, the Soviet Red Army deployed mechanized armored divisions, relentless heavy artillery barrages, and an inexhaustible supply of infantry. On the other side stood a man who defied every conventional metric of a lethal military operative. Simo Häyhä stood exactly 5 feet tall, 1.52 meters. He possessed no elite military pedigree, no specialized sniper training, and he carried a standard-issue infantry rifle that belonged to a previous generation of warfare. When you run the tactical probabilities of a lone, undersized farmer attempting to halt the advance of an industrialized military empire in waist-deep snow, the survival rate calculates to absolute zero. He should have been dead on arrival. Yet entire Soviet battalions were paralyzed by the mere suspicion of his presence. They carpet-bombed empty forests just to kill this one solitary ghost. How does a man with zero physiological or technological advantages mathematically dismantle an entire army? It was not magic. It was not divine intervention. It was the flawless, ruthless execution of an environmental system. The transformation of a man into a statistical anomaly begins long before the first shot is fired. Simo Häyhä was not a soldier who learned how to shoot. He was an apex predator who was handed a military uniform. Before the outbreak of the Winter War, Häyhä spent his entire life tracking foxes in the dense, suffocatingly silent pine forests of Karelia. To hunt a fox in deep winter is an exercise in agonizing micro-adjustments. The animal is small, erratic, and hyper-aware of environmental disturbances. To kill it, the hunter must calculate shifting wind vectors, erase their own physical footprint, and master the psychological endurance required to remain perfectly still while the human body begs for movement. When the Red Army invaded his home, Häyhä did not learn new tactics. He simply changed his prey. He transferred a lifetime of civilian survival mechanics into an industrialized combat theater. He treated the mechanized Soviet infantry not as a superior military force, but as loud, clumsy, and entirely predictable animals. His primary instrument of execution was the M/28-30. It was a Finnish variant of the standard Mosin Nagant infantry rifle. It was heavy. It was bolt action. It was entirely mechanical. But the most critical variable in his loadout was what he explicitly refused to attach to it. Häyhä rejected the modern advantage of a telescopic scope, relying exclusively on crude, stamped metal iron sights. This decision was not born of rural stubbornness. It was a calculated, lethal adaptation to the physics of his environment. A telescopic scope requires the shooter to raise their head an additional 2 to 3 inches above the weapon's stock to align their eye with the glass. In a sniper duel, 3 inches of exposed forehead is a fatal geometric flaw. Furthermore, at -40 degrees, the ambient heat radiating from a human eye will instantly condense and freeze on a cold glass optic, completely blinding the shooter. And most deadly of all, curved glass is a mirror. It catches the ambient light of the environment. Stamped iron does not fog. It does not shatter. It does not glint. Häyhä willingly accepted the severe physical strain of aiming at human targets 400 yards away without magnification, trading visual comfort for absolute, terrifying invisibility. The environment of the Winter War was not a backdrop. It was an active, indiscriminately lethal weapon. In January of 1940, temperatures on the Kola front plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, the fundamental physics of mechanized warfare begin to collapse. The Soviet strategy relied on overwhelming armored divisions and rapid troop deployment. But at -40, the engine oil inside their T-26 tanks polymerized, turning into a thick, gelatinous sludge that seized moving parts and left armor paralyzed in the snow. The steel bolts of standard Soviet infantry rifles froze shut inside their receivers. But machinery is replaceable. The human body is not. When a human being is exposed to -40 degrees, the circulatory system executes a brutal, involuntary triage. It initiates severe vasoconstriction. Warm blood is aggressively rerouted away from the extremities to protect the core organs. Within minutes, the fingers lose fine motor control. The delicate tactile sensation required to smoothly squeeze a trigger simply vanishes. Frostbite begins to crystallize the water inside the skin cells, effectively destroying the tissue from the inside out. Breathing itself becomes a physical trauma, as the freezing air burns the respiratory tract. The sheer, unending psychological torture of freezing in a trench breaks unit cohesion far faster than enemy artillery. The Soviets fought the cold. Simo Häyhä weaponized it. He understood that in a perfectly white, frozen landscape, the slightest thermal signature or physical disturbance is an immediate death sentence. He engineered a system of physiological workarounds. To counter the thermal signature of his own biology, he packed thick, dense layers of snow directly into his mouth while he waited. This was not a minor discomfort. It was a calculated thermodynamic suppression. The snow cooled his exhalations before they passed his lips, ensuring that no visible plume of warm vapor betrayed his position in the sub-zero air. To counter the mechanical signature of his rifle, he altered the terrain. Before initiating an engagement, he would pour water onto the snowbank directly beneath his rifle barrel. In the extreme cold, it hardened into a solid ice crust within seconds. When a rifle fires, the rapidly expanding gases from the muzzle blast create a violent, forward-facing shockwave. In loose powder, this kicks up a massive white cloud, immediately revealing the shooter's exact coordinates. Häyhä's artificial ice crust absorbed that shockwave. No snow cloud, no vapor, no visual signature. He would lie completely still for hours, buried beneath drifts, deliberately letting his core temperature drop to the absolute limit of human endurance. He became a thermal and visual void. The Soviet High Command did not ignore the devastating attrition rate. They quantified the bleeding, diagnosed the anomaly, and applied a standard, industrialized countermeasure. They deployed specialized counter-sniper units. These were elite operatives, heavily equipped and armed with advanced, magnified optics. On paper, Soviet military doctrine dictated that superior technology and dedicated training would systematically eliminate a lone, under-equipped combatant. But the Soviet strategists fundamentally misunderstood the theater of engagement. They relied on their equipment. Häyhä relied on his instincts. Sniper warfare in a sub-zero environment is not a test of marksmanship. It is an excruciating war of physiological and psychological attrition. It is the agonizing discipline of the wait. Imagine lying prone, compressed into a frozen snowdrift for 8 continuous hours. The ambient cold aggressively drains the caloric energy from your body, gnawing at your extremities as your muscle fibers scream for the relief of movement, for a spasm, for the rush of warm blood. You must fight the vivid, dancing hallucinations induced by snow blindness and sleep deprivation. Every breath is a calculated risk. You listen past the howling wind, filtering out the rustle of splintered pine branches, waiting for the unnatural, heavy crunch of snow under a boot, or the faint scrape of cold metal against bark. The Soviet snipers were patient. They were lethal, but they were human. And humans get cold. Humans get desperate. Late in the afternoon, during a prolonged, suffocating standoff across a dead ravine, a Soviet counter-sniper reached his psychological limit. He needed to acquire his target. He made a slow, agonizing creep forward over the frozen dirt to establish a superior angle on the suspected ridge. But he made one fatal, arrogant miscalculation. He trusted his modern equipment. He used his telescopic scope to scan the dark tree line. At 400 yards, the dying sun caught the curved, polished glass of his objective lens. The physics of light reflection are absolute. It produced a flash, a tiny, brilliant, blinding spark of golden light erupting from an endless, monochromatic sea of gray and white. That is the ultimate tactical blind spot of advanced technology. Häyhä's heart rate flatlined. The burning pain in his freezing limbs was completely overridden by the adrenaline of the hunt. The entire vastness of the Karelian forest compressed into that single, glowing anomaly. He aligned his crude iron sights, trusting his own naked eyes over magnified glass. He calculated the massive bullet drop, he calculated the violent, swirling crosswind, and he slipped his numb finger onto the freezing steel of the trigger. He held the absolute emptiness in his aching lungs. Pressure. Crack. The rifle bucks. The flash of glass shatters into dust. A wet impact. The Soviet slumps into the snow. Dead. The advanced technology that was engineered to guarantee his supremacy was the exact mechanism of his execution. Mathematics is absolute. Probabilities will always correct themselves over a long enough timeline. For 100 days, Simo Häyhä operated within a microscopic statistical margin of error. But on March 6, 1940, the mathematics of the battlefield finally caught up with him. The Soviet command, exhausted by the relentless bleeding of their infantry, ordered a concentrated, indiscriminate bombardment and mass assault on his sector. It was no longer a precise sniper duel. It was a chaotic, volumetric clearing of the grid. Amidst the flying shrapnel and splintering pines, a Soviet soldier fired an explosive bullet into the tree line. It was a random, chaotic variable. The round struck Häyhä squarely in the lower left jaw. An explosive infantry round does not merely puncture, it detonates upon impact. It converts massive kinetic energy into a devastating outward shockwave, designed specifically to shred soft tissue and shatter bone structures. The bullet detonated inside his face. It pulverized his lower mandible, tearing away his left cheek. The physical trauma was catastrophic. The human body is simply not engineered to survive that magnitude of localized explosive force. At -40 degrees, massive arterial blood loss typically induces rapid hypovolemic shock, leading to total systemic failure within minutes. The snow around him turned violently red. He fell into a coma, was evacuated from the front lines, placed on a pile of casualties, and clinically presumed dead. Yet, the same terrifying physiological control that allowed him to lie motionless in the freezing snow for hours somehow kept his autonomic nervous system firing. His heart continued to beat. He refused to die. On March 13, 1940, exactly 1 week after a Soviet explosive round erased half of his face, Simo Häyhä regained consciousness in a military hospital bed. It was the exact day the Winter War officially ended. He did not wake up as a mythological god of war. He woke up as a permanently disfigured farmer, a man who had simply executed a gruesome mathematical equation better than anyone else in human history. We try to romanticize men like him. We want to believe that taking 505 human lives requires a complex psychological framework, a burning, visceral hatred, or a patriotic fervor that overrides basic human morality. But when asked, decades later, if he felt any remorse for the sheer volume of death he inflicted, his response was devoid of any such romanticism. It was cold. It was completely pragmatic. He simply stated, "I did what I was told to do as well as I could." There is no glory in that statement, only terrifying efficiency. He was a product of the freezing Karelia forests, a man who weaponized absolute patience against a mechanized empire. And when the guns finally stopped, the farmer went quietly back to his life. But the environment remembers. If you stand in the Finnish woods in the dead of winter, long after the artillery craters have filled with pristine white snow, the silence is no longer peaceful. It is the suffocating, heavy silence of a ghost who never missed.